in December already. Seems like just yesterday we were welcoming Witold Rubczynski as a literary award winner for his book on Charleston architecture and preservation. So it is so wonderful to see all of you tonight, even if we can't physically actually see you, but to know that you are here. We have so many old friends on this program tonight, as well as new ones. If you are new to the Athenaeum, I hope you will come and find out more about us. Come to our virtual programs, learn about membership and what you can get from being a part of the Athenaeum. We would love to have you as a part of this community of people who care about history and preservation and architecture and literature and art, music, and great conversation about all of that. I want to remind you that during the conversation, anytime you have a question for our speaker, you may leave it in the Q&A or the chat. Click one of those buttons and leave the question, and following her talk, I will moderate those questions. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Whitney Martinko, who is an associate professor of history at Villanova University. She came to Villanova with a BA from Harvard and an MA and PhD in history from the University of Virginia. Whitney grew up in Chillicothe, Ohio, and it was growing up around all of those indigenous earthworks in the Ohio River Valley that spurred her interest in preservation. While she'll talk mostly about Philadelphia preservation today, she also, her book talks about things like indigenous earthworks and how early Americans decided what was worth preserving or not in things that today in our conversation in Philadelphia, we don't traditionally think of as preservation worthy. So I invite you to join me virtually welcoming Whitney Martinko tonight to the Athenaeum. We're so glad you're here, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth, for the invitation, and to Tess so much for helping me to arrange the details to make this talk happen tonight. Tonight, I will be speaking a bit about the early history of historic preservation, which I'm drawing from my new book out this year with Penn Press. It's called Historic Real Estate, Market Morality, and the Politics of Preservation in the Early United States. The book is really the first book-length study of historic preservation in the early nation before the Mount Vernon Ladies Association finalized their purchase of George Washington's estate in 1860. This is really a moment that many historians look to as the birth of the preservation movement. But in my book, I sort of reframe it and show that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was established really coming out of long conversations about historic preservation that had been going on since the War for Independence and even before. Tonight, as Beth mentioned, I'll mainly focus on Philadelphia sites, but I encourage you to pick up my book if you're interested in broader histories of preservation across what became the United States before 1860. So the central argument of my book is that many residents of the early United States engaged in what they themselves called preservation of the built environment to work out really the practical applications of a central concern of the new United States after the Revolution, and indeed what we often call the early modern world. And that was the relationship between public good and private profit. So in the decades after the American Revolution, historic sites made compelling locations to test this correlation, this relationship between public good and private profit, because they were places where the materiality of the past and the materiality of the market economy met. Old churches and houses, indigenous earthworks, town squares, all of these structures weren't just symbols of the past or vessels for collective memory. They were in fact real estate in a fully commoditized environment. In the early United States, advocates of preservation made their plans a principal strategy for creating a new order of property and power promised by revolutionary principles. But unlike leaders of post-revolutionary regimes in France, US citizens did not make historic sites the property of the national government. Instead, they determined to let properties of public interest emerge from private holdings. They defined architectural permanence achieved through preservation as a statement of civic virtue. In their words, a willingness to balance communal and personal interests. And in this way, they embrace the strictures of private property and a capitalist economy by promising to make it moral. In the early 19th century, many Americans were concerned about how the growth of capitalist economies, how this growth was affecting society. And a variety of men and women addressed their growing concerns by turning to sites that encapsulated their anxieties. And these sites that I explore in 3 parts in my book: more corporate properties, commercial sites, and domestic spaces. So I'd like to turn to some specific examples of these sites to give some examples of projects of preservation that were designed to address larger issues of economy and society in the early nation. And so on that previous slide, actually, we can see some examples of corporate properties. Starting in the 1780s, the first type of properties that early Americans really honed in on for preservation efforts were what they often called public historic structures owned by corporate entities. These were town squares held by land companies, municipal cemeteries, landmark houses of worship. Here in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see, for instance, the Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, and above you see what came to be called Mound Cemetery in Marietta, Ohio. And these corporate properties also included governmental buildings. These sites attracted the attention of city residents in the first decades of the United States because their fates were bound up in debates about the relationship between state authority, meaning particularly national authority, and local self-determination. When residents of aspirational and established urban centers debated the material and the legal perpetuity of historic sites, they engaged in larger efforts to define and enforce principles of corporate governance in the new nation. So we can turn to what was called the Old Pennsylvania State House and its adjacent yard, which you see in the next slide here. These are great examples of this interest in corporate sites in Philadelphia. So this building was built in 1735 to serve the colonial Pennsylvania Assembly. And after the Revolution, it served as the Commonwealth's legislature, the home to the legislature, I should say. And when the capital of Pennsylvania moved to Harrisburg in 1812, the legislature decided to sell the old building in Philadelphia to the highest bidder. They planned to demolish the building and divide the land into building lots, which they insisted on selling for the maximum price possible in the city's booming real estate market. So even in the 1810s, Americans recognized this building's significance much as we do today. And that was because it encompassed Independence Hall, where delegates had debated the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So over the course of the 1810s, several Philadelphians, such as newspaper editor William Duane, argued that it was both the legal right and the moral duty of the City Corporation of Philadelphia to preserve this building and the green space around it. Should the Commonwealth sell to real estate speculators, Duane charged, they would sacrifice the public good to capitalist greed. In this way, Duane was making arguments in the language of market morality to lob insults at his political foes. He used what I call in my book, the politics of demolition, to argue that citizens who are willing to demolish sites of shared importance to maximize profit should not be placed in positions of political authority. But he was also making a broader argument about the responsibility of a municipal corporation at a time when they were in flux. In the years after the American Revolution, the years after the American Revolution really constituted what many historians have called a municipal revolution. And this was when a wave of Americans enacted municipal incorporation to increase local participation and local autonomy in the early United States. This had happened in 1789 in Philadelphia, when white male citizens had rechartered the city and transitioned the city charter from one that incorporated a city governance that was really focused simply on managing town market operations to an elected body that was responsible for the good of all citizens living within Philadelphia. So when Duane was criticizing or sort of making the argument that Philadelphia as a city was responsible for this building, he was really making the argument that corporations should consider the maintenance of some sites as permanent features of the city as crucial to the public duty that they were meant to serve. And we see, as I mentioned, similar conversations happening in cities across the United States in these decades. Now, by the 1820s, swings in an increasingly speculative capitalist economy brought a new type of historic property under scrutiny. And this was commercial sites, or localities characterized by their position in marketplaces of goods and real estate. Between the Panic of 1819 and the Panic of 1837, business proprietors and political partisans defined preservation as a means to create opportunities for, and in some cases, limits on commercial profit in a speculative economy. And on the next slide, we can see some examples of the way that this happened. Merchants and tavern proprietors, even men, primarily men at this point, who are making images like the ones that we see here, really perpetuated historic architecture as a means of engaging in a competitive market economy of goods, enticing customers with a historically conscious vision of what they deemed was respectable consumption of what was for sale in this growing marketplace in the second quarter of the 19th century. So on the next slide, we can see an example from here in Philadelphia. And we can see it in action with this really great advertisement for William Brown's clothing store. It was published in the 1830s. So Brown appealed to consumer morality with an advertising poster that depicted his historic storefront and its abundant display of menswear, right? We see a floor-to-ceiling display windows, a modern sidewalk, and a display case that really spoke to Brown's, what he would say at the time would be modern commercial sensibilities, right? He was, yet at the same time, he was a purveyor of ready-made attire, right? This is ready-made clothing in an era when most people went to tailors and luxury stores for bespoke items. Second, ready-made clothing wasn't by nature as respectable. And what's more is that his location on Market Street also stood a block removed from the most fashionable shopping district in Philadelphia, and those were the retail stores on Chestnut Street. So Brown's poster really contended that he, even though he was selling ready-made clothing, even though he was on Market Street, he offered customers a more exclusive and respectable shopping venue than did his upscale competitors. We can see this in that large sign over the door announcing that this was the birthplace of liberty, where Thomas Jefferson had drafted the Declaration of Independence. And so, as I mentioned, Brown's advertisement is really seeking to merge the act of shopping for ready-made clothing with veneration of a historic site to increase the respectability of his business. And in doing so, he modeled not only what a moral consumer looked like, but he modeled himself as a model preservationist, right? Somebody who was a model steward, we could say, of a very significant historic building. On the next slide, some of you may recognize what this is now, right? The building was demolished in 1883, but it has been reconstructed. So this is on the southwest corner of the intersection of Market and 7th, and it's what's called and interpreted by the National Park Service as the Declaration House. So this, I would say, is an example of maybe a layer of history of this building that's been reconstructed that is not been preserved in a prominent place in its history today. Some contemporaries of William Brown, however, argued that historic sites really should be set apart from commercial enterprise. And on the next slide, we can see that Carpenter's Hall here in Philadelphia is one of those places. Partisan political writers of the time condemned the treatment of old buildings as commercial sites and often encouraged readers to treat them as sacred spaces whose permanence should be secured outside the bounds of speculative markets for goods and for real estate. So this was the case in Carpenter's Hall, the lower floor of which served as an auction house from the 1820s through the 1850s. There's a really great written account of this space that I discuss in my book, written by an incoming congressman from New York who was traveling from the Hudson Valley down to Washington, D.C. in 1829. And he visited this space on his way through Philadelphia and discussed being inside this building and how walking around this space revived for him the voice of Patrick Henry. But he says that this ability of the building to speak to the past was drowned out by the clatter of an auction house and a school that was renting the space upstairs. And he made this broad appeal, again, that was published in multiple newspapers at the time, that this site, he thought, should be set aside from all market activity and kept as it existed in the past. And in fact, the Carpenters Company bought into this vision later in the 1850s when they kicked out the auctioneer and restored, in their words, the interior in many ways that you can see today. So both types of these appeals, those of the congressman calling for the removal of commercial spaces from historic buildings, and people like Brown, who really marketed themselves and their buildings as a crucial part of the commercial economy. Both of these calls operated in a broader constellation of economic schemes to define moral commerce for a new era of finance, of labor, of industrial production, and even of marketing and advertising in these antebellum decades. But by the 1830s, pushback against this incursion of commerce into historic spaces really grew around a particular type of site, and that site was old houses. So in the next slide, we see a sketch of what was often called the slate roof house, a former abode of William Penn, here as it was drawn in 1841. You can see there are multiple shops in this house. You can see the show windows have been carved out of the front wall. And by this time, there was really a sort of a value that many Americans expressed, that respectable houses were meant to be set apart from commerce and market forces, whether they were historic or whether they were brand new ones. But men and women in the 1840s and 1850s frequently argued over the merits of old houses and ancestral estates to debate how capitalism affected not just the market economy, but also domestic economy and family structures. And as women exerted more authority over domestic economy, right, the work that's done in the house, the spending, the labor that happens in houses, some men moved to preserve domestic spaces as sites of public historic interest. Many middling men, sort of middle-class men, created plans to make old houses the property of incorporated voluntary societies, particularly historical societies, where they developed this sort of mode of promoting an idea of sort of anti-luxury and promoting a mode of civic housekeeping that really reclaimed a place for men as the moral and material leaders of American home and society. And we can see a great example of this in Philadelphia with John Fanning Watson's proposal to turn a different Penn family house, supposedly, into a historic house museum. And that was, as we see in the next slide, the Letitia House, supposedly built for William Penn's daughter, and supposedly inhabited by her. It was originally on 2nd Street, but here we see it as it was removed to Fairmount Park in the 19th century. It's pictured here around the first decade of the 20th century. So John Fanning Watson, he was a bank clerk in Germantown. He's a well-known local historian of the era. And he hoped that a historical association devoted to William Penn would purchase this house when it was still in Philadelphia and furnish it with Penn family furniture and other antiques that he had collected and open it to visitors. In letters to one of his buds, John J. Smith, Watson made a clear plan that was informed as much by the state of the city's real estate market and the labor market in the city, as much as it was about his ideas about the past. And Watson really hoped to profit from a growing interest in visiting the homes of famous men. This was a booming interest in the 1830s and 1840s, in part due to the explosion of biographies of sort of the so-called the great men of America and of Europe. And so Watson designed his plans as an enterprise in a way that he saw himself as a moral manager of a home. He thought that a widow would make an ideal proprietor for this antiquarian establishment, and thought that this hostess might, as he put it, secure good company by serving light fare, something alluring for the ladies, he said, as well as providing a space or sort of a place of respite from market goers in the nearby Head House Market when they were coming to Philadelphia from the countryside. But really, hospitality, he said, should not outshine the historical lessons that could be taught in a historic home that was furnished with items from the past. Of course, women in this era had their own ideas about what good domestic economy looked like, and particularly what it looked like in an old house. We can see Deborah Norris Logan, who lived at Stenton in this time and worked with both John Fanning Watson and with John J. Smith, as a great exemplar of how women's ideas of keeping home and sort of moral economy in an old home contrasted with those of Watson. And I speak a bit about her in my book as well. And as women made as women in this era more frequently earned their own money, made consumer purchases with cash instead of credit, and hired household help, men like Watson devised plans for preservation to really have a sort of a public way of demonstrating their ability to do these same tasks, but with the public good in mind. And when they aim to preserve historic house interiors under the construction or sort of under the management of a voluntary association, they frame civic housekeeping as an activity that any improving man, or sort of self-improving man, could take part in, right? He didn't need a family, he didn't need a lot of money for his own sort of fancy home, that in fact he could do a public service by civic housekeeping in historic houses. Now, by contrast, we see heirs of ancestral estates adopting new modes of sort of what we might call rural improvement, certain architectural and landscape architecture styles, to position themselves as patriarchs for a new generation, maintaining their familial homes while also parceling off outlying tracts in what was becoming suburban land markets. Now, by the 1840s, many Americans saw an estate preserved by multiple generations of family descendants as a very rare thing. The revolutionary generation had defined widespread land ownership as a necessary feature of a modern republic. And political leaders shaped estate law to encourage the dispersion of land to freeholders rather than the consolidation of family property in aristocratic land holdings, right? This is one of the promises of the American Revolution. And as a result, many Americans at this moment saw the dissipation of ancestral estates as a way of life in the United States. We can see this in the next slide happening at an estate that many of you may know, and that is the Woodlands here in West Philadelphia. So Louisa Catherine Adams, the wife of the president, John Quincy Adams, really took this perspective when she reflected on the fate of the Hamilton family estate outside of Philadelphia here in 1822. The most recent owner in the Hamilton family had been the fourth generation of his family to own this property. And when he died without a will and childless in 1817, the estate descended to his nieces and nephews. Now, when Louisa Catherine Adams visited, she saw the impending fate of this property as a typical one. So she wrote in a letter, "The Woodlands is really a beautiful spot, but like most of the property in our country, it is to be sold and can no longer remain in the hands of the old proprietors, as it must be divided between the family." So some Hamilton heirs tried to secure ownership of the Woodlands by purchasing the estate, but standing debts and high expenses landed the property at sheriff's sale in 1827. And this really was increasingly the fate of many of these large-scale, colonized, sort of massive family holdings of estates across the United States in the former colonies by the 19th century. So in similar situations, descendants of other large colonial land-owning families like the Hamiltons here in Pennsylvania pursued a model of what I call evolutionary preservation, in which they rebuilt their family seats, their family houses, in the style of rural improvement, while selling off surrounding lands. So in the next slide, I'll go a little bit outside of Philadelphia to the Warren family estate in Roxbury, Massachusetts, for an example of this. In 1846, John Collins Warren, who was a medical doctor, very well known, affiliated with Harvard Medical School at the time, Warren built what in fact was sort of a domestic monument to his ancestors' clapboard farmhouse by building this stone cottage in the style of the architect A.J. Downing. So on the facade of this house, you might be able to sort of see those two plaques in this pictures between the first and the second stories. Warren inset a pair of engraved marble slabs, and they read, "On this spot stood the house erected by Joseph Warren of Boston, remarkable for being the birthplace of General Joseph Warren, his grandson, who was killed at Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775. On the other plaque, he wrote, "John Warren, a distinguished anatomist, was also born here. The original house being in ruins, this house was built by John C. Warren, MD, in 1846, son of the last named, as a permanent memorial of the spot." So these are actually engraved on those two plaques that you see on the house as I photographed it a couple years back. These plaques in many ways made the new house a tombstone for the old house, marking stages in its life and death in sort of residential epics. A new stone wall bounded the front yard. It's sort of just outside of the photo here. Front yard is memorial grounds. And nearly a decade later, Warren would transpose many of the features that you see in this home, in the estate, into Roxbury's rural cemetery, Forest Hills, where he reinterred the remains of all of his relatives that he had exhumed from the old Roxbury burying ground and the family vault in St. Paul's Church in Boston. So Warren himself had no intention of living at this home place of his forefathers. Instead, he built this house as a rental property, in fact, and he sold off building lots around it. You can see this in the next slide, which is also happens to be the image on the cover of my book. And you can see here, it's the plan of the Warren family estate. The birthplace is prominently marked, as are many of the old elms that were preserved by Warren. And in fact, there are many similar cases like this in New England, in the Hudson River Valley in New York, and in Kentucky, where family members and outside observers alike really fused conceptions of new houses like this that were meant to be sort of a reconstruction or a memorial of an old one. They infused the new houses with the history of the former house and really considered these family estates one and the same. Even though these are like purely new reconstructions, they really saw them as embodiments and preservation projects of the old house. And in fact, when marrying the sort of the new construction of these so-called, preserved new houses with divisions of these really old family land holdings, many people felt that this sort of enabled what they called a civil suburban development on the fringe of expanding cities. So the epilogue of my book is really a reframing of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, as I mentioned, and their efforts to purchase George Washington's estate, which was in fact one of these old multi-generational family estates. In the next slide, you see an early group of the women who founded the MVLA, which the founding was led by Anne Pamela Cunningham at the end of 1853, when she issued a nationwide call for, in her words, ladies, to preserve the estate of George Washington from capitalist development. And as I mentioned before, I really reframe this as not so much the birth of the preservation movement, but as an outgrowth of many of these long-standing debates over the historic sites, over corporate properties, commercial sites, and family homes that I just gave you a very brief overview of. One thing I think that's interesting to note in this talk is that Cunningham, she was from South Carolina. She's often referred to as being a matron from South Carolina. But in fact, she spent a lot of time in Philadelphia, and she wrote many of her initial appeals to preserve Mount Vernon from right here in Philadelphia. She also worked with a number of women who lived in Philadelphia full time, one of whom is Elizabeth Whitney Millward. And she really coordinated Philadelphia women as well, and their efforts to raise money happened in conjunction with other efforts here in Philadelphia to preserve historic sites, particularly revolutionary ones. So for instance, we know that the collection boxes for raising money to purchase Mount Vernon sat in Independence Hall, and they sat in direct competition with boxes that were there to raise funds for building the Washington Monument. And as I mentioned, Carpenter's Hall was undergoing restoration in the late 1850s at the same time as well. So we often think about Mount Vernon as being sort of a Southern project, but in fact, much of the work was connected directly here to Philadelphia. So to sort of wrap up and think about what might this new history of preservation mean for us today, I think that we can start with a picture of an Onion article that was published a few years back on the next slide. And maybe some of you remember it. It was published during the search for HQ2, right, the second headquarters of Amazon. And you can see that the headline read, "Confident Philadelphians preemptively raise Center City to make room for Amazon headquarters." It was one of those Onion headlines that hits a little bit too close to home, maybe, right? And seems like a little too possible to just be parody. And in the article, a lampooned Mayor Kenny said, and this is sort of quoting from the Onion article, he said, "It was definitely bittersweet saying goodbye to the Liberty Bell before a controlled demolition of Independence Hall. But it's important we encourage businesses to invest in the city," adding that his office was also evicting 100,000 Philadelphia residents living outside of Center City in order to give relocating Amazon employees access to homes and schools in the most desirable neighborhoods. Philadelphians, the fake Mayor Kenny said, "should rest assured, however, that we will work to preserve access to our beloved city's historic legacy." And in the Onion article, this meant that Philadelphia historic sites and artifacts would be removed to a museum like many miles outside of the city itself, and that residents would have to take a train to a different city to see these artifacts. So of course, this article's humor arises from the supposedly absurd treatment of one of the nation's most cherished historic monuments, and treating it as prime real estate. But when I first read it, I was just floored by the connections that I saw between issues that I was writing about and issues issues that I was writing about from the early 19th century and issues that were addressed in this parody article. Because of course, 200 years previously, the owners of Independence Hall had in fact planned to sell it for demolition and business development. And the resulting campaign to preserve Independence Hall in the 1810s, in fact, featured some of the very same critiques of urban development, of capitalist greed, and corrupt public interest that appeared in the Onion 2 centuries later. So in the context of the history that I was writing, this article really showed how Americans have long looked to historic sites, not simply to commemorate the past, but also to define what should and what should not be for sale particularly during times of economic transition. So to that point, I think it's really important to recognize that debates about the fate of historic structures and about historic preservation more broadly were central to founding the United States. Americans did not invent historic preservation, and they were constantly defining their projects in conversation and comparison to ones that were happening in Europe. I talk about many of these in the book and didn't have time to get into them today. But early Americans did debate the fate of buildings to work out how exactly Americans would bring into being the promises of a Republican society and serve the common weal at a moment when capitalism and speculative economies were expanding. Now, this founding narrative is important, I think, because it shows that the United States is not some sort of fundamentally or essentially forward-looking nation, like some people, I think, want to characterize it, where people who preserved evidence of the past were somehow outside of the mainstream, or were trying to stop economic development or operate out of some sort of nostalgia, or being just totally checked out from the everyday world. But at the same time, I think it's important to see the motives and consequences of early advocates of preservation with clear eyes in the context of their times. Today I have really focused on the ideals that were promulgated by these early generations of historic preservation advocates. But too often we refer to these individuals as some sort of saviors or people who are ahead of their time. But in fact, their motives and actions, often served as a means of exclusion and erasure and removal of people and of places. And this was often done for personal profit at the expense of others. In Philadelphia, for instance, we can see this clearly when efforts to, restore the original city squares of William Penn's urban plan erase the presence of Black gathering places, burials of Black and indigent Philadelphians, and places of business of working class Philadelphians who were working in the informal economy, or sort of the underground economy. More broadly, I think this early history really helps us to confront the ways that preservation served as a tool of colonization. In the next slide, I've included again a picture of Marietta, Ohio, where we see sort of preservation being a means of appropriating indigenous lands with narratives of preserving so-called ancient America. This really was a means of validating some attempts at architectural permanence while ignoring or removing others. For instance, the efforts of many indigenous communities to remain on ancestral homelands in places ranging from, Massachusetts and Rhode Island to North Carolina. These were never praised as historic preservation and were never supported. Instead, they were really overlooked in favor of the architecture of European colonization being celebrated as historic alongside the removal of indigenous architecture of the 19th century. So confronting the complex history of sites like these, considering histories of material change and the language used to describe them, I think, can bring to light the exclusions, the transformations, and the demolitions enacted to secure particular remnants of the past. This approach will help make visible the ways that people in different times and different places have shaped projects of preservation to exert power and to resist it, and to call attention to the power of architectural preservation to do the same today. Ultimately, I believe this strategy can help a wider variety of people to see how historic places can matter to them, and can help to make arguments about what variations really constitute what it means to have a historical integrity of a building or of a historic place. Most importantly, I think this new history of preservation shows that how we define preservation is a way of defining what sort of economic and social values we subscribe to. When we think about the so-called public good of preservation, we should be thinking about who we hire, how much we pay them, who we invite to the table to these conversations, and why exactly we think that a certain building really needs to stand the test of time. In Philadelphia, we're facing a crisis of demolition in the built environment, but I also think we're facing a crisis of inequality in the whiteness and the wealth and the labor practices of preservation today. Looking to the past should remind us that we ourselves are historical actors and that we have the power to confront these challenges of preservation. To my mind, fields of sustainability, as I featured on the next slide, fields like maintenance studies, environmental justice, and a feminist ethics of care offer a few fields that historic preservation can team up with to address its problematic historical legacies and envision an even more broadly inclusive notion of the public when we talk about historic preservation. In any model, however, history can help us to see our fundamental definitions of preservation as a practice and as an ethic that continues that constitutes economic and social values in our own world today, and how our approaches to historic preservation are ultimately a statement of how we value people, not buildings. So I'll stop there for tonight, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you. And hopefully Tess will let my picture show again. She hid me. All right. Thank you so much, Whitney. There have been questions coming in as you've been talking. Let me see, let's start with the idea. When was it first contended? And maybe this would be different in the US than it was elsewhere. As you noted, we were not the first to the table when it came to preservation. When was it first contended that preservation of historic properties could promote commerce such as tourism?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have sort of a formal, definitive date, but I will say that, in the 18th century, there was a massive growth of tourism, particularly linked to historic sites. And one of those sites in the 18th century was the birthplace of William Shakespeare. And so I mentioned this briefly in my book, but in the 18th century was a huge culture of tourism around sites, particularly related to sort of historic individuals and birthplaces.
And then we saw that with the linking here, question about the linking of patriotism with the preservation of historic sites, particularly with the founding fathers or founding documents or the Revolutionary War. And when did that conversation emerge? Was it starting right after the Revolutionary War? Was it, as you talked about, like with Mount Vernon in the 1860s?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of really great scholarship about, particularly about the rise of historic memory, as we often call it, around the revolution, right? The revolutionary sites, battlegrounds, revolutionary generals. There was always an interest in it, and this scholarship really points to the 1820s as a moment, sort of the 50th anniversary of the War for Independence, the dying off of many veterans of the revolution. So there was really a burst of sort of celebrations and attention to historic sites in the 1820s. That said, there was not all interest in historic preservation and historic sites revolved around the revolution or revolutionary sites. Many people celebrated sort of colonial architecture, right? The beginning of French, of English, and of Spanish architecture in North America. And this was celebrated rather than opposed because it was seen as a critical part of the story of the development of the United States. At the same time, we see sites that are celebrated as simply the oldest building in town, right? They're not associated necessarily with an event or a famous person, but they're seen as old and oftentimes ugly, right? So there's a lot of conversation around preserving features, built structures that aren't necessarily beautiful or sort of contributing to the aesthetic of a town, but they're felt that they are important because they sort of mark an epic, sort of a moment, a stage of development in so-called the primitive United States.
And there's a question here about the pioneering efforts of 20th century women to found what's the Society of Landmarks, including their exhibition of needlework at Wanamaker's department store. Wondering if you could say anything about that. And if you could lean on to that, I think as you sort of talked about the role of women in preservation, maybe talk a little bit more about how women really kind of came to play a big part in preservation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know anything too specific about the women who founded the Landmarks group. It doesn't surprise me that they exhibited needlework or that they exhibited in a commercial space, right, at Wanamaker's. That's really fascinating. I'm sure there are probably people on this call who know more about this specific exhibit than I do. But I can say that I talk about gender a bit more in my book than I did tonight, but it's really surprising. It was surprising to me at first to see how many men were the primary purveyors of these plans for, again, in their words, preservation in the early 19th century. And I think that really speaks to the centrality of seeing these sites as matters of economy, as matters of real estate, as matters of, really sort of shaping sites in conversation with broader politics of creating the United States and sort of the public sphere. That doesn't mean that women weren't involved, but we see women becoming involved in different ways later in the 19th century. As ideas of gender change, as ideas of women's role in society, particularly related to the home, change as well. And of course, women had long been involved in benevolent societies in the 19th century. So as benevolence extends to these historic sites, we also see women become more involved.
So here's an interesting question. I'm popped over to the chat side, asking, there are many regulations and protocols now in place to ensure that conversations and actions occur regarding historic preservation. Many professionals have entire careers grounded in these efforts, and wondering if you think those regulations and protocols are still viable and appropriate in light of your new history of preservation.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's sort of a fast and easy answer to that. I think that there are probably, a lot of good, regulations and protocols, which of course vary widely, right? If we're sort of thinking about the National Historic Preservation Act and the sort of like section 106s coming out of that, versus we could think about Philadelphia, right? And every other town and city and township in the US probably has sort of distinct regulations from that. I think that this is a little bit of a sidestep from that question, but I will say that one of the most inspiring books that I've read is a book of edited, very short essays by Marla Miller and Max Page. And it's sort of looking back at the National Historic Preservation Act on its 50th anniversary and sort of envisioning what could a new toolkit look like for preservation. And there are many different answers to that. So are these regulations and protocols still viable in my new vision of preservation? Sure, some of them are, but I think that it's worth taking a new look and seeing where we can amend them to perhaps be more expansive and inclusive.
And so here's a comment from one person leading to a question from another. One of our attendees says, I always thought that Mount Vernon Ladies was the start of the preservation movement here, and that your thesis about the struggle against capitalist use of historic sites and demolition is very enlightening and relevant lens in seeing today's issues. The concerns about keeping neighborhoods intact for lower income families instead of demolishing them and building new cheap construction. So thank you for these insights. So leading from that, here's a question. There's a recently published book, Hidden Philadelphia, which among other things seems to celebrate that Philadelphia was not as economically vigorous as New York City, maybe like in the 20th century. Therefore, we have more bones and skeletons. And wondering if Philadelphia is doing a good job, given that we have what we have left to work with, or are we not relative to other U.S. cities?
So is Philadelphia doing a good job with preservation relative to other US cities? I would say no. I think that there's a lot of work to be done in Philadelphia. I don't say that to be just sort of like negative about the city, but I do think that there is, really a need to reconsider a lot of fundamental policies in the city to make preservation something that a wider variety of people want to get on board with, to make things like designation, the process and meetings something that a wider variety of people can participate in and feel welcome at. And I think there need to be more resources and more incentives for folks to get on board again with preservation. And for me, I mentioned a number of other fields. I think that if we broaden our idea of what preservation of historic sites can mean and include things like maintenance, right? And think about sustainability, which I think is a more capacious way of thinking about the preservation of neighborhoods, right? Of local economies, of small businesses, that could be, one way to move forward.
And someone else would love to know if you, whoops, I have to get to the right one again. What you would consider to be a good example of preservation in the Philadelphia area that meets your criteria of diversity, and wondering what you think of efforts by more recent free market economists to treat preservation efforts as positive externalities.
Oh gosh,
I'm not similar tension between the sacred space and places.
Yeah, I'm not an economist, so I'm afraid that question is a bit outside of my wheelhouse. I think that, good examples, I think that there is a real movement to sort of tell more inclusive stories, right? Proposals to, potential proposals to have sort of cluster nomination around LGBTQ sites. There's been more, sort of a little bit more attention to thinking about reinterpreting some sites that are already protected or on the register to include women's history, for instance. I think that I would like to see more sites associated with Black history in Philadelphia sort of be nominated. I know that there's a real push by many to designate the Henry Minton House, for instance. And I think something beyond pointing to a specific example would be to tell what many preservationists and historians called layered histories of places, right? To really think about preserving the entire history of a building. This isn't a new concept by any means, but I think that there's a lot more space to do that in Philadelphia and to think a bit more expansively about what integrity means in the context of the city's history and the city's built environment.
So Mary notes, it's interesting that at the same time that early preservationists were motivated by questions of morality, the burgeoning rural cemetery movement also saw their project as a force for moral education, as well as for encouraging patriotic feeling in visitors. And wondering if you wanted to say anything more about that?
Yeah, and there is a lot of similarity, particularly, as I noted, sort of at the Woodlands, you see this, a lot of overlap with the same ideals of folks who are instrumental in founding a number of rural cemeteries, and in fact, sort of use that format to preserve historic sites. So I think that the rural cemetery movement is very much a part of that architecture of rural improvement that included homes, that included cemeteries, that included farms and gardens and sort of planted landscapes more broadly. So I think that that you're absolutely right to make that connection.
So that's an interesting question here, I think, which kind of get to what would be our own as individuals' responsibility if we purchase a home that has some sort of historical significance in the architecture or a famous person or event. What sort of responsibility would we as the owner have as far as the idea of market morality with your thesis to sustain a public good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to be clear, that the market morality in my title and that I talk about, I really focused on that as a constructed ideal that's coming out of the 19th century. And I am not sort of weighing in and saying this is the correct, the moral behavior, right? So I'm more interested in the construction of this idea of market morality, even if that can even be a thing. So I want to make clear that I'm not trying to sort of like level some idea that there is the preservation is the moral way to participate in the market, right? That is, I am not saying that. I'm interested in how people create the idea that it is somehow moral, because of course many of the people who say they're operating morally in the market are perpetuating slavery or are colonizers, right? So these people who are early preservationists who are touting this idea of market morality, I'm not saying that they are in fact moral or are even operating morally in the market. So, I don't think that I have sort of a statement about what homeowners should or should not do if they own a home, but I would hope that they would take an interest in their home, work with local historians, archives, community groups, and hope that they would be motivated to teach and to learn in community.
And for those who do have interest in the homes that you have, as you know, the Athenaeum is a wonderful resource finding out more about your home in the greater Philadelphia area, or your property, or where you were born, or anything else you wanted to know. I think of one last question here. Interested in how displays of historical relics in public exhibitions help to promote historical preservation efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in fact, I spoke about the Warren House, right? And before John Collins Warren tore down the wooden farmhouse, or I guess as he tore it down, I should say, he collected relics from that farmhouse and built a miniature replica, and he gave it to his sister, who of course did not inherit any of the land. And she and her descendants, in fact, displayed this as part of a patriotic exhibition in the Old South Meeting House in Boston in 1876 related to the centennial. And this was to raise money for the preservation of the Old South Meeting House. So that specific story is sort of one of many ways that we can see a real connection between the display of relics, the sort of idea of raising of money, and sort of the continued circle of preservation, sometimes built on charging money to see the relics of demolished buildings.
Thank you so much. This has just been fascinating and so interesting, as we're hearing from folks on the chat. We so appreciate the time that you've given us. You've given us a lot to think about. You can buy this book at bookshop.org, /shop/Phila-Athenaeum. Find it that link on our website to get to bookshop.org. Portion of those proceeds do continue to support the Athenaeum, and the other proceeds go to help independent bookstores. So I encourage you to buy this book on that site. We have a few more programs coming up as we wind up our fall season, so I hope you will register for them and enjoy our evening programs. December 8th, Gerald Kaufman talking about sustainability and fisheries in our local watershed. And on the 9th, Salute, France in Philadelphia. The book has just been published by Therese Dolan and Lynn Miller, wonderful Athenaeum friends. We hope you will share with us. And we are so pleased to have you all here tonight. Wish you all have a wonderful evening. Whitney, thank you again. And we will be getting you to the Athenaeum when we are open again so that you can use our resources and enjoy this wonderful space. We look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much.